I wonder if you like puzzles. Me, I'm not really a big fan. Puzzles are difficult, but do you know what makes finishing a puzzle almost impossible? It's when you don't have the picture on the outside of the box. The only way to put specific pieces of a puzzle together that I know of is by having the big picture on the front of the box. And the same is true with the Bible. We'll only understand specific texts of the Bible when we understand how they connect to the bigger story the Bible is actually telling. For example, listen to the question the Pharisees asked Jesus in Luke chapter 17, verses 20 and 21. What do the Pharisees want Jesus to tell them? They ask, Luke says, the Pharisees, when the kingdom of God would come. Pharisees were coming to Jesus and they were asking him, where is this kingdom that you're talking about? Now, I don't know if the question the Pharisees was asking was really serious, like they really did actually want to know, because Jesus had been preaching about the kingdom of God like all the time. And one of the things he had been saying over and over was that it was at hand. It had drawn near. That was a major part of Jesus's message. And yet the Pharisees are acting like they never heard Jesus say that. And so I guess it could almost be like they're being sarcastic. Like, where is this kingdom of God that you keep talking about? But whether they're sincere or not, you're not going to understand this specific question or Jesus's answer in this particular passage unless you step back and understand what the kingdom of God is and why it's significant. You have to get the context, and the context is the Old Testament. And this is so important because what happens so often is we come to the Bible with our context, with the questions that we think are so interesting, and we try to force the Bible to answer our questions. But if we're going to be transformed by the Bible, we have to know the Bible and its context so well that it tells us the questions that we're supposed to ask. And certainly, one of the questions that was pressing in on the minds of the people in Jesus' day as they were reading the Old Testament had to do with the establishment of the kingdom of God. To understand the Gospels, to understand the New Testament, you have to understand that one of the questions the people Jesus was preaching to were asking was when and how the kingdom of God was going to be established. And that question was pressing on their minds for a couple of reasons. One, because as we've kept saying over and over again throughout these videos, the kingdom of God was such a big part of what the Old Testament was about. As we went back to summarize the message of the Bible, we saw clearly that one of the main things the Bible is about is the kingdom of God. What is God's good plan according to Genesis 1 and 2? It's to establish this kingdom where man rules as his representative, and we experience the blessing and presence of God forever and ever. And so obviously we should all be interested in seeing that happen. How is God going to establish the kingdom of God on earth? We should all be asking that question. But as we keep reading our Bible, we see it was a question the Jewish people in Jesus' day should have been especially interested in, because the Old Testament tells us that not only did God promise to establish this kingdom, which is awesome, but that he also promised to bring that kingdom into existence through the descendants of Abraham. There's a promised kingdom, that's the what, and there's a plan for establishing that kingdom through the offspring of Abraham. That's the how. The Jewish people could literally open their Bible and see that God had made them some very particular promises in these things we call covenants. If the kingdom is the what and the covenant is the how, the covenants describe how God is going to establish this kingdom. First, we saw he told Abraham about making his descendants into a great nation and giving them land and blessing them. And telling him that those who bless them would be blessed and those who curse them would be cursed, and eventually they would defeat their enemies, and that maybe most importantly, through their nation Israel, he would bring blessing to the entire world. Where do we find that promise? You remember? Genesis 12, such a key promise. And that's there almost at the beginning of the Bible to tell us this is what makes the history of Israel so significant. Because as we read their story, we're trying to figure out how God is going to use them to reverse the curse and establish the kingdom he promised and complete what he started in the garden. And in the next covenant God makes with Israel, we think we might be seeing exactly how he's going to use them to accomplish that. Where's the next covenant found? Exodus 19 and following. Each covenant is a picture, and each picture expands our understanding of God's strategy. And we call this covenant the Mosaic covenant. God tells the nation of Israel that if they'll just obey him, he would make them into a kingdom of priests. In other words, they would represent him. And as they obeyed, they would image God to the world, and he would bless them in such a significant way that the whole world would see and be drawn to the kingdom of God. But the problem is, they didn't. Just like Adam, they rebelled, and instead of becoming different from the nations, they became like the nations, and they even ended up saying to God, we want a king for the purpose of becoming like the nations. And so if you picture Israel almost like a second Adam being put back into the garden by God after all this training, it's not like God just put him in the promised land again. He got them ready to succeed, and yet if you picture them like a second Adam, this would be like God putting Adam in the garden again, and the first thing that he does is run back to the tree and eat not just one fruit, but every single one. This is absolute rebellion. And so we have to be wondering about God's response. And the good news is God didn't give up on them at that point. And instead, he reaffirms his commitment to the plan he started. And this is 2 Samuel 7, where God comes to David and says, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I'll plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. Which is God saying, in spite of all this rebellion, I'm still committed to the promise I made to Abraham all these years later. And then he goes on and says, violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. And you remember that word rest. Where does the Bible talk about rest? Genesis chapter 2 is where it begins. And I guess I'm just trying to help you see why the Pharisees and others would have been so interested in the kingdom of God. It's not just because this idea of the kingdom of God is awesome. It's also because God made these incredible promises to Abraham, to Moses, and to David. In spite of how badly Israel kept failing, God keeps coming back and reaffirming his commitment. Israel is going to become the kingdom of God. And yet, again, by now, we're wondering, how is that going to be possible? Because Israel has proven themselves so disobedient. And so God takes this promise he made to Abraham and he advances it. In the Old Testament, it's like we start with the big idea, Genesis 1 and 2, God's establishing the kingdom. And then the problem, Genesis 3, man's rebellion. And of course, Genesis 3:15, the promise, Satan's defeat. But the question is how? And so throughout the Old Testament, God's explaining how he's going to fix this. And the thing is, he doesn't give this explanation all at once. It's like he's pulling these pictures out one by one, and each picture shows us just a little more about how God's going to deliver us, and you kind of have to put these pictures together. So one, bang, God puts it on the table. It's going to happen on this planet, the Noahic covenant. Then two, it's going to be through Israel, the Abrahamic covenant. Then 3, he's going to establish them as a holy nation that serves as his representatives to the world, the Mosaic covenant. Now 4, he's going to give them a king, 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom," which is huge because this is a promised king who will rule over God's kingdom forever. And yet the problem we saw as we keep reading Samuel and Kings is that the descendants who come from David, for the most part, weren't godly leaders at all. You don't want them to be the king who rules forever. They themselves can't keep the Mosaic covenant, much less help Israel do it. You take the next king, Solomon, who had every possible advantage. In fact, God gave him supernatural wisdom to be able to govern, and yet by the end of his life, he had strayed so far from God, and after he died, things only got worse until it got so bad that these descendants of David eventually got the whole nation kicked out of the promised land. And I guess I'm not sure I can tell you how significant that was in terms of the biblical story. I mean, kicked out of the promised land. If you're reading your Old Testament, that's kind of earth-shattering, really. In Genesis, God makes the kingdom, and it's perfect and beautiful, and you're like, yeah, that's how things should be. And then man rebels, and he's kicked out of the kingdom, and you're like, no, that's not how things should be. But then God makes a promise, and it's, again, he's going to defeat Satan. And you think it might be through Noah because he's righteous and his name means rest, and there's a prophecy about him, and God even starts the whole world again, and you're like, maybe this is going to happen. But then Noah does the same thing Adam did, and the world heads the same direction it did before, and you're like, no, are you kidding me? But then God makes a promise to Abraham about establishing his kingdom through his descendants. And you're like, okay, we're headed in the right direction again. And the way God talks about it, it sounds like he's planning to put this nation in Canaan. And it's almost as if he's taking this whole nation back to the Garden of Eden. And if they obey, the picture is of them doing as a nation what Adam was supposed to do in the beginning. And so you have some hope because you notice God goes to a lot of effort to train them. And he gives them all these laws and he gives them all these sacrifices. It's like he doesn't just put them in the garden. He prepares them before they go back to the garden so they can do what he's calling them to do when they get there. And you're like, yes, it is on. And especially when you read Joshua and you see God keeping all his promises, and you're like, yes, 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 until right after that, Judges, the very next book. You see, the nation of Israel doesn't keep any of the promises they made to God. Instead, they totally reject him and end up as pagan as everyone else until they come and say to God, they don't want him to be their king. And yet God's patient and says, I'm going to send you a great king from the line of David. And so you think maybe this is the solution. A godly king will do it, only to have Israel get so bad after that. By the end of the Old Testament story in Kings, God sends them back to the very place they started with Abraham. You know how I keep saying the Old Testament tells a story. The whole story is basically told in Genesis through Kings. That's where you find pretty much the main part of the story. And way back in Genesis, we saw God calling Abraham out of Babylon to start this nation that's going to bring blessing to the world. And yet the point is, when you fast forward to Kings, you see God sending that very nation all these years later back to Babylon because they're just like everyone else. And you're like, what is going on? What is going on? In fact, there's this really sad scene in Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, when Israel was in the wilderness. God told them to make a tabernacle, a place where he would live with them, which is really amazing. And after they made the tabernacle, it says the glory of God came and filled it. You remember the story in Exodus, right? Moses couldn't even enter at the end of Exodus. And that's so huge because that's like Garden of Eden stuff. God living with you. And it gets better because the tabernacle was a tent, and so it was temporary, which is why later, when they get to the promised land, they turn that tent into a building they call the temple. And when they made the temple, you remember what happened? 1 Kings 8, 10, and 11. Same thing as Exodus. God's glory comes. And it's just so awesome because God's coming and living with these people. This is like heaven on earth. This is their Garden of Eden moment. God living among them. And yet in Ezekiel, after all this sin and rebellion, some of them are taken to Babylon. The process of judgment has started, but it's going in stages. So there's this group that goes back to Babylon, and there's still a group back in Jerusalem. And even though they're being judged, they still have some hope. And the reason they had hope was because they had the temple. And so some of them thought, yeah, it looks bad, but still we can't be defeated, right? Because God lives with us. And yet Ezekiel sees this vision in Ezekiel 10, verses 18 and 19. And you know what it's a vision of? It's a vision basically of God packing up and leaving the temple. It's like God's moving out. And he's saying he's seeing the glory of God leaving the temple. And so we're wondering now, the point is we're wondering as we're watching Israel being taken back to where they started, Babylon, and as we're watching God sort of get up and move out of what we think of as his earthly home, the temple, we're wondering, does this mean God's finally finished with his plan? Are you following? It's like we saw Adam and he failed, but we had hope because there was Noah. And then he failed, and yet we had hope because there was Israel. And yet now we see Israel, this whole nation fails. And we know that's a problem for Israel, but again, if we're reading our Bibles properly, we also know it's a major problem for us. Israel's failure is a problem for us because ever since man got kicked out of the garden, we're standing there looking for a way back in. How can we get this world back to the original or better? How can the kingdom of God be established? We're looking and thinking, how do we get back in? And God said he's going to bring us back in through Israel somehow. And yet now, after all these years and all this reading, it's like Israel, as we finish the story, is on the outside looking in with the rest of us as well. And so if God's not finished with his plan, we need to know how. How is he going to establish the kingdom he promised with the way sin is so obviously broken absolutely everything? Which is why in come the prophets. And we're going to look at what they have to say, the answer they provide in the next lesson.